Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Jacobin Talks. My name is Micah Utrecht. I'm the deputy editor of Jacobin. And since the pandemic began, we have been doing these talks on YouTube about 3 times a week. And we ask that you chime in to the discussion. If you are watching this live on YouTube or on Facebook, chime in the comments section with your questions or comments. I'll do my best to read as many of them as possible. Before we start with today's discussion, on Wednesday, we are going to have a talk with Branko Milanovic on Wednesday at 6 p.m. on the future of capitalism. He'll be talking about his book, Capitalism Alone, on what it means that capitalism is the only economic system left in the world. And that's on Wednesday at 6 p.m. And then on the issue description of this discussion, there is a link for our for a subscription for our new issue, Failure is an Option, which just came out on the U.S. as a failed state. So if you're looking for some uplifting reading, check it out. Once again, in the episode description of this on YouTube, you can get a discount link for those of you who are watching on YouTube. We give our appreciation to you by offering you a discounted subscription to read the new issue of Jacobin. And today, I am joined for a discussion with Kevin Young. Kevin is a historian at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and he's also the co-author of the book Levers of Power: How the 1% Rules and What the 99% Can Do About It, from Verso earlier this year. And Kevin, if you'll indulge me, I cannot say enough good things about this book. I read it over the summer. I honestly think it's like a worthy follow-up to something like Poor People's Movements by Francis Fox Piven and Richard Cloward, in terms of its scope, in terms of the sort of rigor with which it approaches the question of how social change happens in America, and does it through using case studies of things that we're all interested in, everything from wringing out change on the environment, to how the Vietnam War, to how the civil rights movement won different gains, to what the discussions on things like healthcare reform look like under Obamacare. It's an excellent book. And as people who have heard me talk about books on this channel or on my podcast, the vast majority know, it is less than 200 pages, which is the length that God intended all books to be. So, even if you hate it, it's over quickly. So highly recommend the book. And we're gonna be talking about it. And thanks for joining us to talk about it.
It's good to be here. Thanks.
So let's just, I want to discuss what the implications of the arguments that you make in the book are for the forthcoming Biden administration. But you wrote this book in the summer. Before then, and also I should mention before we get into the discussion, we have run 2 excerpts of the book in Jacobin. One, How Capital Strikes Yanked Barack Obama's Presidency to the Right, and another, How Local Civil Rights Protests Produce an Increase in War on Poverty Spending. And I think you'll probably be making references to both of those issues as in our discussion. But so let's just talk first about the kind of like basic argument about what the levers of power are for the 99%, as your subtitle has it. What are the what are you setting out to do with this book, and what are the basic arguments about these levers of power that are open to the 99%, to the working class, and how does the working class pull those levers?
Well, we actually start with talking about how the 1% wields power, because we think that that is really important for understanding how the rest of us can wield political power. So the argument about the foundations of corporate political influence is where we start the book, and then the second half of the book goes on to talking about what social movements can do about it. So the analysis of how elites wield political power is really important for then understanding the argument that we make about social movement strategy. So in terms of how the 1% wields political power, when most people think about political influence and the pull that corporations have in our government, they think about corporate campaign finance or lobbying. And what we try to argue is that the levers of power that the 1% has goes way deeper than just that. The root of corporate political influence is ultimately the control that corporations and banks wield over the economy itself. They're the ones who control the resources that the rest of society needs to be able to function. So it's not just about money and politics. They have a whole range of weapons at their disposal, not just limited to campaign donations and lobbyists and so on. So much of the book is a discussion of the Obama administration. And I think that this is really important for understanding the context now, because, despite the differences in personality between Obama and Biden, perhaps there's a real similarity between our situation now with an incoming Democratic president who has promised some, at least on paper, some fairly progressive things. And the Obama administration, which was elected 12 years ago and came into power also promising some progressive things. So one of the big questions that the book sets out to answer is, why is it that we didn't get more robust progressive change under Obama? So I think that understanding why that is a first step for understanding how the 99% can try to pressure Biden and try to win some concessions from this new Democratic administration.
And so can you get into some of the corporate constraints on, like, using the Obama administration, for example, as a case study, which the segment of the book that we published in Jacobin about how capital strikes and how about capital generally constrained what the Obama administration was able to do independently of what Obama himself did or did not want to do. Can you talk about that in the case of the Obama administration and how that might impact a Biden administration?
Yeah, so it was really striking the way that Obama came into office with this very strong mandate for progressive change. He had promised to rein in the healthcare industries, to take on fossil fuels, to make it easier for labor unions to organize workers, and a bunch of other things. And he was backed up by public opinion, the same way that Biden has a progressive mandate in public opinion, at least on many economic issues and foreign policy issues and environmental issues. Public opinion is very progressive, much more progressive than we often realize. So when Obama was coming into office, he had this very strong mandate. If we look at public opinion polls, a large majority of the population supported universal health care and supported robust environmental regulations. But what we saw from the actual record of policy is that in the case of climate legislation, the reform efforts under Obama failed entirely. The legislation never made it through the Congress, with the partial exception of some stimulus funding in 2009, which was dedicated toward alternative energy. But the climate legislation, the main climate legislation, House and Senate failed. And in the case of healthcare reform, we get the Affordable Care Act, which was from the start a highly compromised and pro-corporate version of healthcare. So why was this? Well, part of the reason has to do with campaign donations to the president and to Congress, of course. But if we look more deeply at the pressures to which Obama was actually responding in 2009, 2010, and onward, we see that corporations in the affected sectors, in the industries that were going to be affected by these reforms, were waging a continuous capital strike. Just as workers can go on strike by withholding their labor, capitalists can go on strike too by withholding the investments that everyone else needs. So banks were refusing to loan money to sort of re-energize the real economy. This was in the midst of the Great Recession, which is an important piece of context here. And corporations across the board were refusing to hire. And this decision that they were making to engage in this this disinvestment from the real economy was not just because of some natural or objective market conditions that were unfavorable for their investment. They were also wielding that disinvestment for political purposes. They said, we won't invest this money by hiring workers or making loans until we get what we want from the Obama administration. So what does that mean? That means, first of all, you're going to have to go to bat for us and do things like negotiating corporate-friendly trade deals, which Obama did, deregulating business, which Obama did, cutting corporate taxes, all of these kinds of things that corporations had on their wish list. Obama was also a very enthusiastic promoter of the fossil fuel industries. And this is something that a lot of people still don't know about Obama's record in office, is the extent to which he increased the pipeline infrastructure and oil drilling and gas drilling across the United States. And this is something that Obama himself actually boasted about to business audiences to try to defend himself against business criticisms. He said, "Look, I've done such a good job for the fossil fuels companies. Look at all of the pipeline that we've laid across the country, enough to encircle the Earth." And actually, he was being modest when he said we've laid enough pipeline to encircle the Earth, because by the time that Obama left office, they had added enough gas and oil pipelines to encircle the Earth 7 times. They also increased oil train shipments in the United States 4,000% during Obama's term in office. So this was just one example of Obama's efforts to promote corporate profitability in the very sectors that he had promised to rein in and bring under control when he was campaigning. And in the case of the fossil fuels industry, it's especially interesting because Obama, the candidate, had not been very dependent at all on fossil fuel industry donations. Fossil fuel donations tend to favor Republicans. They have for the last several decades. They favored Republicans overwhelmingly, in fact. So Obama was not dependent on the cash that he was getting from them. He was dependent, however, on the fossil fuel companies' continued supply of energy for the economy, because the whole economy depended on the energy that came from fossil fuels. So that was a weapon, that was a structural weapon that the fossil fuels companies had and were able to wield. And Obama, looking around him in early 2009 as he was coming into office, realized that in order to reactivate the economy, he needed massive cooperation from corporate America. So much of what Obama did throughout his 8 years in office can be read as an effort to cajole private investment from capitalists in the United States by boosting business confidence. And business confidence was a key buzzword. It still is. If you take a look at the big business press, the goal of all administrations, Democratic or Republican, needs to be to promote private capital investment because the health of the economy depends on it. So that has to be at least one primary goal of administrations in a capitalist society. And that was certainly the case with Obama, and everything indicates that it will also be the case with Joe Biden coming in now. In fact, today, Monday, Biden was meeting with the CEOs of General Motors and Microsoft and Target and the Gap and a few others, in part discuss economic plans going forward. So this is, he's barely elected and he's already meeting with corporate executives. So this is indicative, again, of the same kind of dynamic that we saw with Obama coming into office, where he recognized that private investors, the 1%, were going to be vital to reactivating the economy and ultimately to the political fortunes of the Democratic Party. So this really is a striking indication of the structural power that corporations wield. It's not just about the campaign donations that they give to politicians in order to buy influence. It's not just about the lobbyists that they send to Washington.
Now, I want to respond to several things that you just said there, and I obviously want the bulk of our conversation to be about Biden, but I have some questions about Obama first. So, on the first one, a big emphasis of your book is that a capital strike is not just the kind of dramatic thing that we saw in, Mitterrand under France, or France under Mitterrand, or Allende's Chile, or any of those kind of dramatic examples that we know about from history. There's a kind of low intensity capital strike sort of always buzzing at all times, and was certainly buzzing under the Obama administration. Maybe, I don't remember if you guys say this or not, but maybe it was buzzing precisely because they knew that this guy had this mandate for change. And so it was important to get capital's view out there very quickly that he absolutely was not going to accomplish anything major or transformational. He wasn't going to do, as Elizabeth Warren calls it, big structural change. So can you just talk about that as an omnipresent factor in any presidency, or just in any kind of social change making under capitalism?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and that's a nice way of saying it. There's sort of a low intensity pressure or calculation that needs to be respected by policymakers if they want to survive in office, if they want to maintain a certain degree of stability in the society. They need to respect business confidence. So business confidence really means the level of goodwill that private investors and executives feel toward your administration, whether you're president or, member of Congress or a governor or a mayor, and we see this at the local level, at the state level, all the way up to the federal government. So one example of this that comes to mind is, Amazon's plans to construct a second headquarters a year or two ago, and they announced this plan, and they said, we will accept bids from any city around the country that wants to put them up. So what happened? 238 different cities sort of fell over themselves trying to see who could offer the most generous subsidies and tax breaks for the Amazon corporation. That's one good example, I think, of the way that this sort of dynamic affects local and state governments as well. So when we hear about governors or mayors or city councils giving these very generous tax breaks to corporations that come and promise to invest and create jobs, as the saying goes. We've become so accustomed to hearing that governments give these big subsidies that we almost don't think anything of it. But I think that's a reflection of how this dynamic happens on an everyday level. It doesn't always take the form. It doesn't actually usually does not take the form of a very dramatic disinvestment from the economy, the way that we saw in Chile in the early 70s or France in the early 80s, as you mentioned. There is this more low-key and continuous pressure that elected governments face to respect the profits and prerogatives of private capital.
Right. The height of the drama was basically that you described from the Obama administration is these quotes in whatever, like Bloomberg Business Week or the Wall Street Journal or whatever. I mean, it wasn't like pitched street battles or anything like that. It was just like corporations saying straight up, this is what we're going to do. We're going to engage in this capital strike. The last question about Obama I want to ask before we move on to Biden is that I was discussing your book with former Jacobin staffer Neil Meyer the other day, and he was not arguing against your argument about capital strikes and how they constrained the Obama administration, but basically saying that he thought that might have let Obama off the hook a little bit, in that it is, whether explicitly or implicitly, an argument that Obama faced these constraints and he would have gotten away with the big structural change if it wasn't for you dastardly corporations going on a capital strike. And so it was like, he felt like the framing was that he wanted to accomplish these things but couldn't because of these structural constraints. Not that those structural constraints don't exist, but that he was not convinced that Obama even wanted to do these things in the first place. That Obama went into the White House with a pretty standard kind of tepid centrist neoliberal agenda, and that he was actually quite successful on his own terms, which is that he did carry out successfully a tepid centrist neoliberal agenda. And it wasn't that he was stymied in anything that he wanted to do. It was that this is what he wanted to do, and he did it. So what would your response to that be?
Well, I would agree with that. I think politicians do have some level of discretion. They have discretion in terms of what they're going to try to do. And then they also have a choice about how they're going to respond to the inevitable backlash that comes from corporations and other powerful institutions. In the case of Obama, it's hard to it's hard to speculate about what exactly would have been possible had Obama, say, pushed the banks harder, or, really prioritized the fight against climate change in his first term, which he didn't do. So it's tempting to speculate, but I really don't know. But I certainly agree that politicians do have some discretion. And in the case of Obama, the conservatism of his policies, the pro-corporate nature of his policies overall, I think it was really over-determined in a way, because Obama himself was, he was a pretty conservative candidate. He certainly was no radical Democrat or even progressive Democrat, really. Various journalistic profiles of Obama, even before he became the nominee, emphasized just how conservative he was. There's a report from the New Yorker in 2007, which characterized Obama as deeply conservative and a conciliator. And the way that campaign donations worked during the Democratic primary in 2007 and 2008 was to select for just that type of candidate, the candidate who is going to be a conciliator. And when they say conciliator, they mean conciliator with business, with military, with the police, and so on. So campaign donations did play a role in kind of selecting for that type of a candidate who's going to get into office. And then when the threat of a capital strike comes along, that candidate is going to be more likely to interpret the capital strike in the right way. Interpret it by saying, okay, we need to go easy on business, or we need to cut taxes for business, or give them some, regulatory relief, that kind of thing, in order to boost their confidence in our administration. So I think that there's a way in which the individual characteristics of the policymaker and the structural power of the 1% sort of work together and reinforce each other.
Yeah, that's great. That moves us nicely into a discussion about Biden, because these considerations are obviously central to figuring out what Biden is or isn't going to do. I mean, everything that we know about Biden's career thus far is that he has been far more than Obama, just a centrist or even center-right politician who's been a steadfast friend to corporations. I mean, on most big political issues of the last several decades, Biden has been on the right-wing side, which is to say the wrong side of those, whether it's, busing or mass incarceration or welfare reform or the war in Iraq or anything else, which was not even true of Obama, as sort of tepid as he was. So, talk about the how these two things are going to interact, these structural constraints that any president faces, mixing with Biden's own individual proclivities, and maybe just keep it to those two, and then after that we can talk about I have another question about like the forces that can try to dislodge him, but focus on those two things about the structural constraints and his own individual proclivities and instincts as a politician.
Mm-hmm. Well, I certainly agree that Biden is by no means a progressive Democrat. He's a traditional neoliberal, center-right kind of candidate, and he knows that he won despite spitting in the face of progressives within the Democratic Party and outside the Democratic Party. So he doesn't feel especially indebted to progressives now that he's been elected. So I think that one of our tasks right now is to understand Biden's motivations and understand the difficulty of influencing him based on appeals to electoral success. The Democratic Party establishment has roundly ignored progressive criticisms. We've been screaming at the top of our lungs for years that Sanders or someone like him would have been a much more effective candidate against Trump because he actually had something to offer to working class people, including white working class people. The party establishment refused to hear that, and they insisted on running Biden. And, if not for the coronavirus, Biden probably would have lost. As it was, he escaped with a razor-thin margin of victory, ironically, due in large part to progressive organizers and their efforts to turn out the vote in places like Arizona and Philadelphia and Detroit, Wisconsin. But Biden still doesn't feel like he owes much to progressives. So I think that that's something important to keep in mind. Now, I'm not sure exactly how ambitious his reform agenda is going to be. He has put out some plans that on the surface are somewhat progressive and perhaps even a little bit promising. His climate plan is a mixed bag. It's an ambitious $2 trillion plan, but it also contains a lot of negative things. Contains a big emphasis on nuclear power, a lot of emphasis on carbon sequestration and capture. There's an indication already that he's going to try to steer away from anything that directly confronts the power of the fossil fuels companies, which is certainly concerning, along with the promotion of nuclear power. So, I'm not sure at this point what exactly he's going to try to do, but certainly based on his past record going back decades, it would be a big mistake to expect too much from him in the way of progressive initiatives.
Now, you mentioned in your discussion about Obama that Obama came in with a pretty serious mandate for progressive change. We all know in hindsight that his rhetoric was this kind of carefully calibrated to be as vague as possible while making you feel like it was very progressive. But in hindsight, there really wasn't a whole lot of substance to a lot of what he was saying. But in any case, that's the mandate that he came in, and he had control of the White House, of the Senate, and of the House. Now, Biden is going to be coming in, as we all know, with less of that kind of a mandate, despite 4 years of the horrors of Trumpism. We don't know yet whether the Democrats will have control of the Senate. Certainly won't be a filibuster-proof majority, and they lost ground in the House rather than gaining it as they had hoped. So those conditions seem much worse for a president who, as we've just been discussing, is his predilection is not to carry out any kind of progressive social change. On the other hand, what we do have now at this point is a reborn left in the United States. As weak as it still is, I'm a member of the Democratic Socialists of America. I don't want to overstate how important the Democratic Socialists of America is, because we have a very long ways to go before we have anything but a handful of people in elected office at the national level, for example. But we do have this newly reborn left, broadly speaking, and in the weeks since the election, we've seen that it is a top priority for the Democratic Party, for the Nancy Pelosi's of the world and the Jim Clyburns of the world, to attack this rising left, to say that their poor performance in this election cycle is because they were running on socialism and a kind of bold left-wing agenda. I mean, that was the first thing that they wanted to do out of the gate, is to try to kneecap that left narrative that was emerging in American politics, which seems like a good thing from the left perspective, because it's like, oh, okay, these people, we know they're far more powerful than we are. We don't have any illusions about how strong the left is at this point. But the fact that they feel the need to attack us, that's the first thing that they want to do coming out of Election Day, is promising, I guess. And that will mean good things for our ability to hopefully wring some concessions out of them once Biden takes office in January. Not any kind of automatic process, but like at least they see us as an enemy that is to be defeated, that they have to worry about in their day-to-day functioning. Am I wrong about that? Have I inflated my own sense of self-importance, or is the left actually something to that the Democrats are going to have to wrangle with?
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think during the last decade in particular, there's been a real uptick in progressive organizing around the country. We've seen this with Occupy Wall Street at the start of the decade, 2011, the Black Lives Matter movement and the broader movement for Black lives. Various anti-racist, pro-immigrant rights organizing that's been going on. So a reinvigorated labor movement, at least in some sectors of the labor movement, with the teacher strikes that have taken place, 2012 with Chicago, and then the last several years, this wave of teacher strikes, including in so-called red states, that's been really impressive, inspiring example of the extent to which ordinary working class people are ready and willing to organize and take collective action to improve their lives. So I think that Pelosi and Clyburn and Biden and Schumer are certainly concerned about the left. They have been, at least for the last few years, and certainly they detest Bernie Sanders and are more willing to lose an election to Trump than to lose to Sanders. And I think that's what they were ultimately willing to do when they put Biden up for the nomination. Now, I think there's an interesting question about how we go about pushing a Biden administration and Pelosi and the rest to the left, and what that actually looks like in practice. And I am a little bit skeptical about the ability to push these people to the left simply by protesting against them or criticizing them, because I think that they are almost impervious to the criticisms of the left at this point. I think that arguably a more effective route to pushing policy to the left under Biden is going to be going after the centers of corporate and institutional power that operate behind the scenes, in which ultimately call the shots, whether it's Democrats or Republicans in office. So we deal with some examples of this kind of organizing and movement pressure in the book, if you want me to talk about those. I think there are some lessons for the days ahead.
Well, yeah, that was what I was going to ask, is because you guys say repeatedly throughout the book that your argument about what the target of protest should be, that it is not individual politicians, it is government organizations and corporations, right? So explain that argument, and then maybe can you tease out a little bit what that would, like, what are some examples of the targets that would be ripe for protesting and for pressuring under the Biden administration?
Mm-hmm. Well, this argument about social movements really comes out of the argument about capital strikes. If corporations are so capable of thwarting any sort of progressive reform that politicians are putting forward, then what that ultimately means is that it's not the politicians who are the real architects of policy. They're not the ones who are really determining the way that policy is going to be made and how it's going to be implemented. So in order to actually change policy for the better, to change it in a real progressive direction, it makes more sense, in my view, to go after the corporate and institutional bases of power. So in the economy, that means banks and corporations and other employers. In terms of government institutions, it means institutions like the police and the Border Patrol and ICE and the Pentagon and so on. We look at a few examples, a few well-known examples from U.S. history, but we sort of reinterpret some of these famous victories of the left from the 20th century. So we look, for instance, at the Wagner Act. The Wagner Act, which was also known as the National Labor Relations Act, passed in 1935 under FDR. This guaranteed the right of private sector workers to unionize, and it was a key hallmark piece of the New Deal. It's still around today in somewhat weakened form, but it's nonetheless an important. It was an important social democratic reform passed in the 1930s. So one of the conventional narratives about the Wagner Act is that, of course, it was FDR who came in, and the Democrats had control of the White House and control of Congress, and that allowed for the passage of the Wagner Act. The Supreme Court later upheld the Wagner Act in 1937, and therefore that allowed workers to go on and organize and defend their interests. Our interpretation of the Wagner Act is quite different than that. We emphasize the conservatism of FDR when he came into office. We need to remember that FDR was elected in 1932 based on a pretty conservative fiscal platform. He was talking about balancing the budget. He was not talking about promoting the right of workers to unionize. That was something that he took up only very reluctantly around the middle of 1934, in fact. This was a year and a half after he entered office. And he reluctantly came around to the idea of legislation that would protect workers' right to organize. In response to this incredible upsurge in strikes in 1933 and the first half of 1934. The number of strikes quadrupled in the United States between early 1933 and late 1933. So that was what Congress was largely responding to in 1935 when it passed the Wagner Act and FDR agreed to sign it. However, the Wagner Act, when it was passed, was basically a dead letter. It didn't have any real implementation power contained within the act. And as a result, employers all across the country basically ignored it. They refused to let their workers unionize. Even after the Supreme Court in 1937 upheld the Wagner Act, it was still not being implemented in industries around the country. But what we see in 1935 to 1937 is thousands upon thousands of more strikes by workers. And this actually continued through the late 30s and early, at the beginning of the 1940s as well. And it was that upsurge of shop floor militancy. If we look at the Flint sit-down strike, 36 to 37, that was the iconic example of the strike that forced General Motors to come around and recognize the United Auto Workers Union. And then there were scores of other examples of sit-down strikes throughout the rest of 1937 in industries across the country. So by the late 1930s, as a result of this disruption, this chronic systematic disruption of U.S. industry, we see first the auto giants, GM and Chrysler, and then eventually Ford, who was notoriously anti-union and anti-Semitic and a lot of other things. They finally came around and recognized the right of their workers to unionize. And then other industries followed suit. So this was an incredible example of how direct disruption of corporate power and corporate profits paved the way for this successful social democratic reform that was eventually implemented in a relatively robust way. So that's one example. We also look at some examples from the 1960s. We try to reevaluate the history of the civil rights movement and the reasons for the civil rights movement's success. The standard narrative, if there is one, about the civil rights movement is that we had peaceful protesters in the South who refused to be provoked by white supremacist violence, and through their extraordinary moral courage and dignity, they inspired the white liberals in the North to come in and pressure the JFK and Johnson administrations to intervene in the South and to dismantle Jim Crow segregation and eventually to pass the Voting Rights Act in 1965. So that's the conventional narrative, which places a lot of credit in the hands of Northern white liberals. Northern white Democrats coming in and kind of saving the day because they were so shocked and outraged by these horrendous images of dogs and fire hoses being used against protesters in Birmingham in 1963. But that narrative is profoundly misleading in some important ways. And actually, the first scholar to challenge that narrative, and we draw part of our discussion of the movement from this guy, Alden Morris, who's a sociologist, wrote a great book about the origin of the civil rights movement. And he really took on that notion, that standard notion about why the protesters in Birmingham, Alabama, which was kind of the key civil rights campaign in the South, which led to the introduction of the Civil Rights Act by JFK, how it was that they were able to succeed. It wasn't primarily because they were able to elicit the moral sympathies of liberal white people in the North. The answer had much more to do with the ability of the protesters in Birmingham to directly disrupt the economy in a way that cost the Birmingham merchants in the downtown millions of dollars in the spring of 1963 through boycotts, through sit-ins, through massive marches that literally shut down the whole downtown and deprived those merchants of not just the black customers, but also the white customers. The white customers stayed away from the stores because they were afraid of the protesters and they didn't want to get mixed up in what was going on downtown. So over the course of about a month or so in Birmingham, the merchants suffer these enormous economic losses. And as a result, it's the merchants who come around and go to the police and go to the mayor and demand that they negotiate with the movement and stop violently resisting racial integration. And this was a conscious strategy of the movement in Birmingham. The civil rights organizers, the local organizers, as well as the folks who came in from the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was MLK's organization, they had a very conscious strategy to target the merchants in downtown Birmingham, using their economic power of boycotts and other disruption to force the economic elite of Birmingham to pressure the political elite, the city government and the police, to stop repressing the movement and allow for racial integration. Martin Luther King Jr. himself, later on that year, after the victory, he reflected on this, and he was comparing the victory at Birmingham in the spring of '63 with the previous major campaign, which had been in Albany, Georgia, in 1961 and '62. And he was reflecting on why the campaign in Georgia failed to achieve its key goals of integration, whereas the campaign in Birmingham had succeeded. And there's a great quote from Martin Luther King Jr. speaking in November of 1963, where he reflects on this difference. And he says that in Albany, Georgia, we made a strategic error. All of our marches in Albany were marches to the city hall trying to make them negotiate, where if we had centered our protests at the stores, the businesses in the city, we could have made the merchants negotiate. If you can pull them around, you pull the political power structure, because really the political power structure listens to the economic power structure. So this is a really important piece for understanding the larger dynamics at play in the success of the civil rights movement. This was MLK himself, and it wasn't necessarily just his strategy. It was the strategy of local organizers who had developed this approach of targeting economic power as a way of influencing the government. And we argue that this sort of dynamic applies in the 1930s. It applies in the 1960s with the success of the Black-led movements. It applies to the end of the war in Vietnam for reasons that, well, you'll have to read the book to find out. I don't know that we have time to go into right now. But we argue that this is a more generalized pattern in the political dynamics of the United States, and it's important for understanding how social movements actually wield political power in at many different times and places.
Now, before we turn it over to audience questions, just a really quick follow-up to that. So what are the equivalents of MLK noting that they should have not marched on City Hall, but instead marched on the downtown business owners? I mean, what are the downtown business owners for, the 21st century left under President Joe Biden that we should be focusing our ire on rather than Joe Biden
I think
himself?
that one of the reasons why the organizers in Birmingham succeeded is that they created a split between different sectors of the elite. They created a split between a portion of the economic elite, the merchants in particular, and the political elite and the rest of the white supremacist power structure. And, it's not, victories today are not going to look exactly the same as they did then. I think we need to be creative, and we need to keep in mind that things are going to look different. Our strategies are going to look different. But this basic principle about trying to target those sectors of the 1% who are most vulnerable and or most capable of producing the changes that we want to see in government. That basic approach is still sound. And I think there's one example that has kind of gone under the radar the last few years, but it's actually a really important example of how social movements have been influencing policy under the Trump administration. So we think of Trump as being completely invulnerable and immune to social movement pressures from the left, but that hasn't actually been the case. Trump has been substantially constrained in some really important ways. If we look at the climate movement and the indigenous movement, which has been organizing to try to stop the construction of pipelines, what Obama had been bragging about expanding. There's been a huge movement against pipelines, especially with the Keystone XL pipeline and the Dakota Access pipeline. And this is really sprung up over the last decade. This is one of those really inspiring and really important social movement struggles that has cropped up just in the space of the last decade. And it has started to yield some real victories here in the sense of getting judges to deny pipeline permits, to issue environmental review mandates, and to otherwise obstruct and impede the construction of new pipelines and even the operation of existing pipelines like the Dakota Access pipeline. So the movement's use of lawsuits in conjunction with these more direct means of obstruction, physical resistance, civil disobedience, vandalism in some cases of pipeline infrastructure, that has had a real impact. And another aspect of the movement, of course, is the divestment movement, which has been targeting banks, fossil fuels companies, and other investors, including insurers, to try to get them to stop investing in and insuring pipelines, which are really crucial for the operation of the fossil fuels industry more broadly. So I think that there's a real chance that we have here with this movement to create a split or to exacerbate a split between the fossil fuel companies themselves, including the pipeline companies, and the investors who give them money. Because the investors who give them money are not necessarily committed just to that industry in the way that Exxon, for instance, is, or TransCanada, or Energy Transfer Partners. The investors just want to make a profit. They don't necessarily want to expand the production and supply of fossil fuels. So I think that there's a real opportunity that the movement has to push those investors to divest their money from the fossil fuel industry and instead put it into alternative energy. And that's already been happening. If you read the business press, it's the best way to get a sense of the impacts that the movement is actually having. And there's, all of these analyses being put out, places like Bloomberg and the Financial Times and these more specialized investor publications warning about the impact that the movement is having, the impact that resistance of various kinds, from lawsuits to civil disobedience to divestment, is having on the behavior of investors. So we're approaching a moment at which finance capital is going to start divesting in a big way from the fossil fuels companies. And that actually has very little to do with electoral politics. So even when Trump is in office, we've been seeing that happening. And as Biden moves in, I would expect this trend to accelerate. So this is, I think, a very hopeful sign for those of us who are concerned about maintaining the habitability of the earth. And it's a social movement advance that has been made in spite of the fact that we have a far-right president in the White House.
Got a question from our producer, Kale, who does not want to look to a Biden presidency, but he wants to play the hits. He wants to talk about Bernie Sanders. And he asks, does the fact that Capitol was united against Bernie during his run for president, or if the, paraphrasing here, if Capitol was united against Bernie, certainly in when he was running, but if he had won in the general election, Capitol certainly would have really come all out against him. Does that mean that his platform is dead on arrival once he would have gotten into office? Is this like uncharted waters for American politics if that had happened? And I guess I would add to that, does Bernie's vision of social change and his constant emphasis on the not me, us, and all the other aspects, he always said that we need a mass movement to overcome. Do you think that the healthcare? I'm like mentally going back to his speeches now, right? It's like, do you think that the healthcare industry is just going to roll over and let us, establish Medicare for all? No, they're going to fight tooth and nail against it. And so obviously that was central to his pitch. And so Kale's question is, what is his agenda dead on arrival, given that Capitol would have been so dead set against him, or is there some hope in his sort of view of change that he was articulating that could have overcome those structural barriers?
There's no question that Sanders would have faced enormous constraints with any major progressive reform that he tried to initiate. And I'm not sure exactly how that would have turned out, but without a powerful and disruptive mass movement that targets not just politicians, but also the corporate sources of resistance to those reform initiatives, I don't think his agenda would have gotten very far at all. So I think that it's fine. I think it's important to have people like Sanders and AOC and Ilhan Omar in our Congress, and raising these issues and saying things that the corporate Democrats refuse to say. It's great that they're in Washington doing that and helping to educate the public and so on. But having them in office is not going to bring about the change that we need. We truly do need a mass movement that is not fixing its sights solely on elections and solely on pressuring politicians. We need a mass movement that can prioritize the non-electoral means of bringing about change, which means building up a movement that can generate massive and sustained disruption at the site of these sources of corporate and institutional power. In the same way that the workers of the 1930s did, the civil rights organizers in the 1960s did, and to some extent the way that the climate and indigenous organizers are doing today in in their attack on the pipelines.
But I guess one of the things that, for me, we learned from the Bernie campaign was that these don't have to be seen as different tasks. Like, it's not like you elect somebody to carry out the progressive change, or you do the disruptive movement stuff. I mean, as I was saying, Bernie made that need for a mass movement. He said that has to be a part of what happens as a result of my presidency. He used his campaign infrastructure to get people out to strikes and immigrant rights protests and everything else. And likewise, AOC talks about the significance of the pipeline protests and her decision to run for office. I mean, these are politicians who at this point are not trying to tamp down any kind of disruptive social movement organizing. They're saying, yes, we need more of that. And they're using their platform in elective office to try to stoke more of it.
Right. And that's really positive. I completely agree with that. And it's a striking contrast with what Obama did after he came into office, which was basically to demobilize the enormous network of volunteer organizers that he had, ridden to victory in 2008. And so, I think that's that's the right approach. And I'm happy that Sanders and AOC and the others are promoting the growth of these kinds of movements.
You got a couple of questions in here. Some of them questions like, you can't leave us hanging. How did the Vietnam War end? Again, you'll have to read the book in order to discover that. We have one question from the sports leader. Could public investment bodies offset some of the impact of capital strikes? I think the sports leader is referring to the proposals for things like public banks, and the argument is that you don't have to be so dependent on private banks, which whenever whenever their fancy strikes them, they can pull investment out of anything that's not profitable. If you have a public bank, that can help reduce the power of those kind of capital strikes. And so should that be a top line item that people, the left, should be pushing for in order to try to weaken the power of those capital strikes?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. And, I think there's a lot of work that still needs to be done in thinking about what the best response to capital strikes is, including the kinds of policy measures that, progressive policymakers, assuming they get into office, can take that are most effective at tamping down the disruption. And public finance is one of those ideas. I think that Jacobin has actually published some stuff, I want to say maybe by Mike McCarthy, on the importance and potential of public financing. And so I think that there has been some work that's been done. I'm probably not the best person to speak about the public finance idea, but it's certainly an intriguing idea and something that we could be pushing for.
And to close us out here, I guess, what are your predictions for this forthcoming Biden era? What do you think will be his top line political agenda items? What will be the impact of the kind of corporate power that we've been discussing through this entire conversation that will constrain his agenda, or is he such a creature of corporate politics that he doesn't even need the corporations to whisper it in his ear what he should be doing, or say in the business press, we're absolutely not going to do XYZ kind of healthcare reform or anything like that. So yeah, what is he going to be up to? What's he going to be constrained by? And what can the left do when that comes down the pike?
Well, I think there's lots of reasons to be pessimistic about Joe Biden. This is a guy who campaigned against Medicare for all in the middle of the worst pandemic in a century. So, on healthcare, I don't expect anything too progressive.
Also, if I can interject, I mean, the thing that still boggles my mind, I'm not the first person to say this, but not only did he say that he would veto Medicare for all if it came across his desk, but that he refused to run on such a slam dunk policy, which would have been a more robust economic aid package for average Americans, millions of whom are suffering under the coronavirus right now. And like, that's needed. Like, if you say that you believe the science on coronavirus, that means that you should then be pushing a robust economic aid package, because that is how people stay home. That's how they don't go to work and get COVID from their coworkers or from customers or whoever. I mean, he refused to even do that. And if this both dire economic moment and incredibly crushing public health crisis doesn't lead him to push for such things, then why do we have any hope that he pushes such things on the campaign trail? Like, he's not like putting forward the legislation. It's just him saying that this would be a good idea. I'm going to fight for this. And he didn't even do that. So that is pretty bleak in terms of what we should expect from him from once he gets into office, from my point of view.
Right. Yeah. I think there's a lot of reasons for us to be pessimistic about Joe Biden. I think we can probably expect a nominally more competent response to the pandemic. But as you said, it's not just about listening to scientists. It's also about actually giving people the minimal safety net, the minimal resources that they need in order to subsist, so that they can actually stay home. I'm not optimistic that Biden and Pelosi and company are going to push for that in any really aggressive way. With the likelihood of Republican control of the Senate, it's looking like we might see a replay of a lot of what we saw during Obama's administration, or at least his second term. But I think the task for us as a left and as progressives remains largely the same: is how do we build the mass movements that are capable of influencing policy regardless of who the office holders are. And in that sense, the task is clear. We can't know exactly what Biden and Harris are going to do. We can't influence and stop them from doing the bad things that they're probably going to be doing once they get into office. But we can control how we respond. And I think in that sense, our responsibility is clear.
Once again, the book is called Levers of Power by our guest Kevin Young, along with Tarun Banerjee and Michael Schwartz. Excellent book, which we've only really skimmed the surface of during this conversation, which is a testament to how much ground you guys cover in the book. If people want to, try it before they buy it, they can read our one or two of our excerpts. The book is so nice, we excerpted it twice. First, this one, How Capital Strikes Yanked Barack Obama's Presidency to the Right. And the second one, a fascinating article, How Local Civil Rights Protests Produced an Increase in War on Poverty Spending, which we didn't talk about. We don't have time to now, but I mean, one of the very fascinating findings from that section of the book is that you guys crunched numbers about war on poverty spending and found that there was more money given to counties in the South where there was more protest that was happening. I mean, a kind of direct one. You're not supposed to say in social science that anything is sort of like definitive proof of anything, but it seems about as close as you could get to finding definitive proof for the impact of disruptive protests on getting the goods for people. So one of many things that you can read about in Levers of Power. And because I forgot to mention it at the beginning, I'll plead for all of you. Surely you have enjoyed this stimulating conversation with Kevin Young. So please like this video, subscribe to our stream. We are almost at 50,000 subscribers to this stream, which is, it's not bad. But we've been stuck there for a little while. We need the people. We need commitments from people to like and subscribe to this stream so that they can see what we're doing here, like these great conversations with Kevin Young. And once again, also on Wednesday, 6 p.m., we have a discussion with Branko Milanovic on the future of capitalism. And of course, we have a new print issue out of Jacobin, Failure is an Option. There's a link in the episode description to get a discounted subscription to our magazine. So, Kevin, thanks so much for tuning in, for joining us as well as tuning in. Thanks to everybody who did tune in, as well as to our producer, Kale. And good night, everybody.